it's the top of the hour, so welcome everybody to our PISCE LDI session here, research session with an esteemed visiting professor. My name is Megan Lanefall, and I'm the Executive Director of PISCE LDI. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Courtney Wilk, who's the Director of Mental Health Implementation Research at PISCE LDI and faculty in the School of Medicine and the Department of Psychiatry, and she will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Megan. I'm so delighted on behalf of PISCE at LDI to welcome Dr. Rosaura Orengo-Aguayo, who is going to be discussing her work today, her community partnered work implementing trauma-focused interventions in Puerto Rico. Dr. Orengo-Aguayo is an associate professor and a bilingual clinical psychologist at the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center within the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina. Her research focuses on addressing mental health disparities among underserved populations, specifically Hispanic youth, through innovative implementation and dissemination methods, including telehealth. She also has a really active program of research focused on cultural adaptation and international dissemination of trauma-focused assessment and intervention. Dr. Orengo-Aguayo was raised in Puerto Rico, where the women and community who collectively raised her taught her the values of compassion, humility, service, social justice, and advocacy, and ongoing self-reflection, which she carries into her professional identity. And her team's mission is really focused on children and families around the world having access to evidence-based, trauma-informed mental health services, regardless of location, language, socioeconomic status, and background. And they achieve this mission through community-based participatory approaches, implementation science, telehealth technology, and principles of cultural humility and language justice in their ongoing work in the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So I'm really looking forward to your talk today, Rosaura. I know everyone else is. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Courtney and Megan and Izzy and everyone present. Before I share my screen, I want to give a little bit of context about myself. I feel like when we hit the slides, we lose that personal touch. So I intentionally have changed my bio to reflect who I really am, not my accomplishments, and that's intentional. I encourage us to do the same. I find that doing this work globally requires that we're our true selves, not our academic selves. And I also am going to share a positionality statement that I've started to really incorporate to just document my values-based work. So, and you can scan that QR code if you want an example of what a positionality statement can look like for you. I include this in my email signature. But I think that more important than my, academic institution or rank is that I identify as a Puerto Rican, Hispanic, cisgender female. My preferred pronoun is ella, which is she in Spanish. My given name is Rosaura. I have a little pronunciation recording in my email about it. And this is really important and relevant to the work I'm going to discuss today, because oftentimes when we're doing global mental health implementation work, the populations we're serving are used to bending backwards for dominant cultures, for English language, changing their name and how it's pronounced. And so we'll be talking a lot about this value of cultural humility and language justice today. I also want to acknowledge my privilege. My parents are in the medical field. I pass as white. I have no accent in English, and I am extremely educated. So I also recognize aspects of my identity that confer me privilege in this work. I also want to start by a few disclaimers today. I am not formally trained in implementation science, as many of us aren't. It's a relatively new field, if you will. I wish I was part of your amazing program or IRI or something like that. I went to a pretty old school graduate program that was still focused on clinical outcome trials, RCTs. And in this work, I ran major RCTs statewide. And I noticed that things just didn't get done. the protocol wasn't followed. Everything fell apart. It was never an easy moment. And that's how I found my way to community-based participatory research and my true passion. And just to put us all in this guiding framework, the world that I'm introducing to you today of implementation of trauma-focused interventions in post-disaster contexts comes from this idea that we need to co-create with our partners. We need to share power. And this is done through the entire process. And I'll be using a lot of anecdotes today. It might not be your typical research talk, but I hope it guides you through how this work is actually implemented on the fly. This is not possible without a team. So I just want to acknowledge my colleagues, past interns, postdocs, faculty at other institutions. And to the right, you see some of the psychologists that we've worked with, in particular in Puerto Rico. I don't have time today to go into our Honduras work, our El Salvador work, our South Carolina work. I'll be focusing on Puerto Rico specifically, but we've been busy for the last 5 to 6 years. So context matters. So Puerto Rico, for those of you who might not know, is one of the last remaining colonies in the world. Yes, there are still colonies in the world. A colony is a country that does not govern itself. So Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. And what that means is that we are ruled by federal law, the United States. However, we're not allowed to vote for the president of the United States. We don't have a voting member in Congress, neither in the House of Representatives or the Senate. We have a non-voting sitting member who can express opinions. Puerto Rico has its own constitution and law, but federal law trumps it. Puerto Rico has a long history of colonialism. So dating back to the Spaniards, the French, a brief dominant history of Cuba trying to conquer us as well. And then ultimately the United States winning, prevailing, and granting US citizenship so that Puerto Ricans could fight in world wars. And this is important because growing up in this context, you develop this ambiguous dual identity of you are part of something, the greatest nation in the world, but not really. And you have your own food and culture and language, but not really. And then on top of that, Puerto Rico is a key strategic military location. So a lot of fighting is over positioning in the Caribbean, over access to resources. Puerto Rico was extremely rich in gold and spices and silver. All has been extracted, by the way. Puerto Ricans have some of the widest genetic diversity in the world. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but it's quite a mixture of populations that have melded. So very interesting. And on top of that, Puerto Rico is gorgeous. It is not, these are no filter pictures. So over 250 miles of beaches, one of the only bioluminescent bays in the world, one of the only rainforests in the United States. And people commune with nature. That's just how we roll. It's all about being outside, connecting with friends and family, food. And also, this is important and relevant because of climate change. So island nations are particularly vulnerable to climate change and its effects, and particularly places that have a history of colonialism because of resource extraction and bad use of land. So the 21st century, we've seen this. The norm is climate change and disasters. Every season we hear on the news, flooding, hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes. And children in particular are one of the most vulnerable populations, over 175 million youth exposed yearly to the risks and effects of climate change. And Puerto Rico is a prime example of this phenomenon. Let me walk you through what has happened since 2016. 2016, there was a Zika endemic. Not sure if folks remember. Zika is a virus transmitted in a mosquito, and it's highly dangerous for pregnant women, can result in birth defects. So in that context, the hurricane activity of September of 2017, if you all recall, this is Maria, Harvey, the great floods in Texas. Puerto Rico went through 2 Category 4 storms within the span of 2 weeks. So Hurricanes Irma destroyed the electrical grid in part of the island. The island recovered, and then pretty much everyone was off guard. No one prepped for Maria, which became a Category 5 as it hovered over the island for 48 hours. Starting my first semester as a faculty member, my first TFCBT trauma supervision with my first student, and Maria was hovering over the island, and I get a WhatsApp message, which is a texting app, from my mom, and she's like, "Can you talk?" And of course I excused myself, said, "Mom, what's going on? I saw the news, another one. Are you guys okay? Are you sheltering?" And all she said was, "Honey, this is really bad." And I didn't hear from her again in a week and a half. That was it. It was very scary. And the media reports that were coming up in social media of distraction were even more scary. So we'll return back to that story because that's the origin story of this work. But also for context, it didn't stop there. So as Puerto Rico was recovering from this horrible storm, in early January of 2020, pre-pandemic, there was a massive series of earthquakes on the western part of the island. And again, we see this new type of disaster, certainly new for Puerto Ricans, resulting in more school closures, more electricity damage, more uncertainty. And here we see what not all disasters are created equal. So, for example, a hurricane has a warning, usually of a week in advance, 2 weeks, with daily updates. And it has a period where it happens and then an end period and no return. Whereas an earthquake has aftershocks, right? So the unpredictability of when will this end? Will it happen again? I'm feeling it again. Also, sheltering is different, right? So imagine community that's used to going to a shelter to avoid floods now cannot be in that shelter because it could collapse, and it's safer to be out in the open. And on top of that, a global pandemic started a month after this new disaster. And as a result, there's an energy crisis now happening in Puerto Rico where the infrastructure cannot keep up. So there's weekly power outages. So about 90% of Puerto Ricans, about 3 million individuals, depend on a generator in their homes so that their refrigerators will work, their stoves will work, they'll have access to phones and internet. So it's a really precarious situation. And so now going to the literature, we know that natural disasters have an effect on children. And we know from great work done by La Greca and colleagues that it's not just post-traumatic stress. You see kids having traumatic grief reactions to losses of pets, of humans, of family members, grieving the loss of social supports. Many times family members migrate and leave due to climate change or disasters and move somewhere else. We also see the negative impact on schooling, academic functioning, etc. And we also know that no 2 kids will have the same experience. Some children have higher risk factors, like losing more things during a disaster, having greater exposure to seeing deaths or flooding or loss of their communities, poor social support. And on the other end, some kids might experience great material loss, but have amazing adults, teachers, friends around them that can help them. We also know that recovery time matters. Something that I've always found interesting was after Hurricane Harvey in Texas, where the massive destruction, devastation, flooding happened, power was restored to most homes within 3 weeks. And that makes sense because there's neighboring states and resources that can be mobilized via land. But again, when island nations get impacted, there is only 2 modes of transportation, air or sea. And in comes colonialism again, and social injustice. So there's this thing called the Jones Act, and it's a very old maritime law that dictates that only US approved ships can bring cargo, basic needs, food, or aid in any circumstance to Puerto Rico. This means that after Hurricane Maria, Cuba and Venezuela sent aid that arrived within 24 hours and was waiting for permission to enter. But it was denied because the ships would have had to go to Miami or Florida, touch base in US soil, obtain a US flag, and come back to Puerto Rico. So even that affects access to resources. We also know that most children do not need therapy after a disaster. In fact, 50 to 70% of children naturally recover and are resilient after a disaster. And it's about 1/3 that needs intensive services. But what do you do to bolster resiliency so that most kids end up in that natural recovery and resilience? What can we do in that period? So that's the subject of this talk. So now let me stop sharing for a second for a little story and we'll get to data. So back to the story of that WhatsApp message, like, honey, it's bad. And then not being able to reach my mom for a week and a half, not knowing where my brother was or my parents or how they were doing. In all that chaos, my team and I got together to support each other. I think that's where I learned what true psychological first aid is. So after a disaster, the best thing that you can do for someone is to instill a sense of calm, safety, hope, offer support, and focus on what the immediate needs are. And my colleague Regan Stewart sat me down and was like, listen, I know that it's scary not knowing what's going on with your family, but let's sit down and brainstorm when we restore communication, what can we do for the island? So we did the usual. We organized a drive, collected supplies from our colleagues at MUSC and other institutions. We put them together. We were ready to go to deliver supplies to the island whenever the airports opened. That didn't seem like enough. And honestly, I knew nothing about post-disaster intervention. All I knew was trauma-focused treatment for traumatized youth, and something seemed off. So in comes my first lesson learned in implementation work post-disaster. Reach out to people who have done this before. Not everything's in the literature, sadly. People don't publish the ins and outs and the steps of what to do in the immediate aftermath. So I was connected with Dr. Melissa Breimer. She's the director of terrorism and disaster programs at UCLA through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. She was one of the key responders to the Sandy Hook tragedy, collaborated closely with the 9/11 attacks, Hurricane Katrina response. And it was awkward. I gave her a call. I don't do calls. I text, I email, but I called her. I introduced myself. And within 30 seconds, she was like, Rosaura, how are you doing? How's your family? And it was this moment of, wow, like no one had asked me that at my institution. No one had really sat down to process what it was like. And after that, she said, I'm going to walk you through what to do in a disaster and what not to do. And she gave me the crash course. So that was really important for me. And I'll talk in a second about what psychological first aid is and how did we implement it. But a parallel story to that is I get another WhatsApp message in this moment. And you might be wondering, how is she doing this? She's working a full-time job getting WhatsApp messages? Like, yep, that was my September of 2017. I would be in supervision, running a meeting, running participants, and I would get these messages and I would drop everything. Because in post-disaster work, there is no timeline. You have to adapt to what the need is in the moment and work quickly. So the second WhatsApp message was from an old friend from Puerto Rico. We went to undergraduate together. She was in the island at the time Maria happened, and she randomly reached out and said, Rosaura, don't have time to explain. We're okay. We're alive. We're in San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico. There's only electricity and cell signal in San Juan. I am here offering help. She's also a psychologist. And what they're wanting are people who are experts or know something about how to help kids after a disaster. Can you help? Little did I know that the person who had made this request, the person she had bumped into, was the Puerto Rico Department of Education secretary at the time. So that's another lesson too in building partnerships. Sometimes you don't know where they come. They might come out of a tragedy, a random text message, and it usually comes out of, I have a need. Do you know anyone? And notice how we don't have a grant for this. We don't have the time for this or the specialty for this, but there's a values-based connection with a need, with an island that needs help and some knowledge in trauma. Okay, let's do this. So we started back and forth in this WhatsApp chat with this Puerto Rico Department of Education secretary, her staff, my colleague, on what the needs were. And what they wanted was training for their teachers before the schools reopened on how to manage grief, loss that the kids had seen, how to manage their own reactions, coping skills, just trauma 101, post-disaster education 101. Now remember, there wasn't internet, there wasn't PowerPoint, virtual was not possible, in-person needed to happen. So they offered to write us a letter to be part of a relief mission. And that's how we were able to land in Puerto Rico 2 weeks later. They also wanted a second thing, a needs assessment. They had over, 350,000 students across the island. They didn't know what their needs were. They didn't know what they needed to assess in terms of mental health, and they wanted guidance on that. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to share my screen again. I usually give this in a 5-hour workshop, so I don't have time how we got here. I'm going to share data with you. This is the data from the needs assessment we did with the Puerto Rico Department of Education. This was published in JAMA Network Open. I say that because I'm still shocked for several reasons. One is this was done with zero funding, zero. This was all collected by volunteer teachers, social workers, Department of Education staff. And all we did was provide the consultation on the instrument, translate the instrument. We analyzed their data. We provided a report for them by schools, by region, by grade, so that they could use. But here are the results. So 3 to 5 months after Maria, the Department of Ed surveyed over 96,000 students island-wide, grades 3 to 12. The reason for this is given the limited nature of resources, it needed to be self-report. Kids needed to be able to write. So we set it as third grade and up to read. This was 42% participation rate and about 50% girls. Now, what was interesting was we don't reinvent the wheel, right? That's another important principle when doing post-disaster implementation work. You don't have time to reinvent the wheel. So we went to the literature, we consulted with colleagues. Hey, what was done after Katrina? Hey, what was done after 9/11 to assess kids' potential traumatic exposure, potential PTSD symptoms, depressive symptoms? And what we found was the National Child Traumatic Stress Network had developed a hurricane assessment and referral tool. It compiled several measures, the UZLARI brief, the hurricane-related traumatic experiences from Greca and colleagues, and the Department of Ed wanted us to assess depression, social support, community violence, and substance use. So we added items to that as well. This was all done on Christmas Eve in 2017. I say that because, again, this work doesn't move in a timeline that you can predict and control. So it becomes a matter of, your team and the willingness to do it in moments where it's not convenient to you, but important to the community partners. Our role here was obtain the permission to use it, translate it to Spanish, consult to make sure the terminology was appropriate, and then the Department of Ed wanted a teacher version that didn't exist, so we created it. Not the most psychometrically sound approach, but the most needed approach for the basic need that the Puerto Rico Department of Education had. And they wanted to administer this throughout all the grades in all the schools and to all the students. Here are some of the most harrowing results. So again, this was collected over a span of about 3 months, 3 to 5 months after Hurricane Maria. And 3 to 5 months after this storm, kids were reporting that about 30% thought they would die. They were at risk of dying during the hurricane, which we know is one of the biggest predictors of development of PTSD after a traumatic event. About a third reported that even 3 to 5 months after Maria, they still were experiencing food and water insecurity, which is very concerning for a US territory, right? So think about in your own community, in your own state, if after an earthquake or a storm or a flood, you didn't know where to get water or food 3 to 5 months after the storm. On top of that, another risk factor for development of social emotional problems after a storm or a disaster is lack of social supports. And 57.8% of kids reported that a family member or a close friend left the island after Maria, meaning that more than half of the kids reporting had lost a key member of their social support network. Now, there's tons of other data here that I don't have time to get into, but I have current interns looking at this more in depth. And we're finding that even the loss of a pet is having significant predictive impact on the development of PTSD over time. This is a very complicated, busy slide. I just want to show something important. What you see on top are the educational regions of Puerto Rico. Imagine the island that's 100 miles east to west by 35 miles north to south. It's divided into these 7 educational regions. Across region, we saw the same results. No differences by geographic location, socioeconomic status, distance from landfall. So what we're seeing was that pretty much across the island, all the kids were experiencing significant disaster exposure and mental health sequelae. And speaking of mental health, so what we found interesting here was that we expected rates of probable PTSD to be higher than this. So after Hurricane Katrina, for example, about 30 to 33% of children 6 months after the storm had tested positive for probable PTSD. Yes, we were testing earlier here, looking at this 3 to 5 months, but it was still pretty low, about 7%, but not inconsequential. As with prior research studies of post-disaster work, girls were more likely to report symptoms of PTSD than boys, and those that experienced greater material loss and fear of dying also were more likely to experience PTSD. So what we prepared for the Department of Ed was like a 3-pager brief document with the highlights of this way more in depth and a very interactive map where they could click on schools and grades within schools and see the data for their school so they can best direct resources. And we concluded, hey, there's a need here for trauma-focused intervention post-disaster work, and we're here to partner. And at the time, we didn't really have a specific grant to do this or mechanism. Everything you just saw was done voluntarily. But what we did have was an existing National Child Traumatic Stress Network SAMHSA grant that had an important component of providing trauma-focused treatment to Hispanic populations in South Carolina. So here's another big lesson learned that I encourage you all to do. We contacted the GPO and had a very serious conversation about how we felt strongly that we needed to expand our scope of work to include Puerto Rico, and they allowed it. On top of that, they invited us to present to Congress about what we were finding and the needs, and we did. So I testified at Congress and provided these data and other data and argued that we needed to expand access to services and trauma-focused funding in particular. So that year, an extra $10 million were awarded to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network for grants to be applied for to work in Puerto Rico and also to address children at the border, because that was another need at the time. So with this in mind, we went back to so we were on the ground I just presented the data that happened later in the development of things to kind of contextualize the impact. But let's go back to that WhatsApp message. Honey, this is bad. Nothing for a week and a half. The Puerto Rico Department of Education secretary reaching out and her staff were going back and forth. And finally, we decided, okay, we're ready. We have supplies we want to take. We had 7 wagons of donations. We had Delta Airlines told us, yeah, take whatever you want. No one's flying there anyways. So we were able to take all that for free. MUSC backed us up. SAMHSA folks backed us up. All this happened in about 3 weeks, and we were on the ground. So when we landed, we met with the Puerto Rico Department of Education and listened to their needs. We were in a dark room, no electricity. Most of them were seeing each other for the first time. And we just sat down and I asked what had been asked of me. How are you doing? When doing a needs assessment with a potential partner, we all have our agendas. We have our 6 million questions we want to ask. We have the next steps we want to get to. And usually, if you notice, we leave time for brief introductions. This should take no more than 5 to 10 minutes. Our brief introduction took 40 minutes on purpose. We spent 40 minutes of 6 heads of state and Department of Education staff just pouring their heart and soul on how horrible this was. Some of them were seeing each other for the first time. Some of them had no home. Some of them hadn't been able to shower in 3 days. And it essentially became a processing group. And that was what was called for in that moment. My team and I, we had never done this. So we remembered what Dr. Breimer told us, follow the need. And the need was they needed this in that moment. They needed someone to instill a sense of calm and safety, to create connectedness, and to offer hope. Those are the principles of psychological first aid. So psychological first aid is an evidence-informed modular approach that was created in response to the September 11th attacks and has been refined for disasters by Breimer and colleagues, the woman I had been consulting. The WHO has a version of psychological first aid. This one was created in collaboration with the National Center for PTSD and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, specifically for families and youth. It has a series of 8 components that are flexibly administered in 1 minute, 5 minutes, never, some are never needed. And the whole goal here is not therapy. It's to reduce initial distress after a traumatic event like a disaster, and to promote short-term functioning and connect to basic needs, and to have a system in place to monitor for future needs. So in that moment, talking to them, we were already using this. The second step that we took when everyone had processed, we checked in and said, what do you feel like the Department of Ed needs to do right now? What's the biggest need? Everyone concurred that their biggest worry was, how are we going to offer support to our staff so that we can reopen schools? We have teachers freaking out. They don't know what's happening in their communities. They don't know how to support their students. How do we support them? So the next logical question is, are there going to be any opportunities, given that it's chaos right now, there's no cell phone service, any meetings that are coming up that we could join, that we could potentially offer psychoeducation and support to teachers? And they said yes. So basically, while we were there, they had planned 6 regional meetings. Like, this was word of mouth. Hey, your region is meeting on Tuesday under this tree in this school at 3 p.m. To talk about schools reopening in your region and what we're going to do. So we basically went to these meetings. And the cool thing about this was that the Department of Ed did a really good job at bringing to these regional meetings FEMA representatives. My God, I have the term in Spanish, compra. They had prepared meals on wheels for each teacher to take home, clothing. So it became this access to basic needs, an informational session about when your school's reopening. And we have an invited resource here to talk about some strategies to help you in this aftermath and cope. So going back to this is a lot. This workshop's delivered usually over 2 days, has a lot of PowerPoint materials and a pretty hefty manual. They told us at most you have maybe an hour with teachers, and if they want to stay a little bit longer, 90 minutes. We need to make this interactive. There's no air conditioning, it's going to be hot, and they needed to be able to take this and apply it in the classroom. So what we did was an abbreviated, so implementation strategy. Let's condense this long manual into a pretty easy to follow. What are some common reactions after a disaster? How might you be feeling? How might your students be feeling? Here are some brief coping skills you can use in the classroom. These are some one pager that you can have with you that we printed for them. And here's all these tables, all these resources. We want to make sure you get what you need for your family that day. And with that, over the span of a week, across 6 regions in the island, we trained 552 teachers and school staff in these very basic PFA principles. So again, because of time, I'm going to kind of move us through. Part of post-disaster work is long-term collaboration and a commitment to that. One of the biggest harms that is done is this helicopter approach of, ooh, this would be really cool to study, and these people seem to have a need. So let me jump in, do my study, do my work, and then I leave and we never talk to you again. So we wanted to model the opposite, particularly because personally, I have lived experience with that approach. And did not feel comfortable with it. So we wrote another grant to get more funding to do phase 2. So after a disaster, and when you do psychological first aid, once things have stabilized enough is when you do a second tier level of intervention. It's still not therapy. And one model of this is called Skills for Psychological Recovery. For those psychologists in the room, you see the components are basic tenets of CBT. They're just broken down into very simple steps that a lay provider can implement and can choose based on the needs of the family. So we went down to Puerto Rico about 6 months after Maria. And again, in partnership with the Department of Education, we trained, there's some social workers and psychologists, school psychologists in this intervention. At the time, this did not exist in Spanish. So part of our work and labor was a translation of these documents to Spanish. And that is a separate conversation about how much of this work, when being done globally to increase language access, the burden falls on the team members because there's no resources to support it. Fun fact, since then, both the psychological first aid Spanish course that we did and the SPR Spanish course are now available for free. We recorded ourselves, and it's an e-learning course as part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. It is very popular, and it's leading to people in Latin America to start connecting with the NCTSN. So this is a picture of when we did that training. And then finally, after we got another grant, and again, this is all SAMHSA funding. Implementation work is really hard to do when you apply for NIH funding, and that was not our goal anyways, to do research. We wanted to bring a treatment to Puerto Rico. So a year later, when things had settled even more, the Department of Education reached out and said, we're ready to train some of our providers in this evidence-based treatment. Can you come? TSCBT web was not available in Spanish. So again, we had to embark on the arduous journey to translate it. It's now available if you want to check it out. And here with the Department of Education, that project was such a success. Again, don't have time to cover it fully, but I do want to share that because of that, Puerto Rico's largest community mental health center reached out. Again, a WhatsApp message. That's how things move in Puerto Rico. Fun story this time. The director of this community mental health center recognized my name, and she thought I was my mom. So my mom and I share the same name and last name, and she's a pediatrician in Puerto Rico with more than 35 years of experience. So the CEO of this community mental health center My mom was a pediatrician for her kids who are now grown adults. And she heard about me and reached out and said, we want to bring TFCBT to our organization. So we trained their psychologist in the spring of 2019, 2020. Of course, COVID happened. We switched to telehealth, and here are the outcomes. And with this, I'll wrap up in 5 minutes, so we have 5 minutes for questions. So again, this is 3.5 years after Maria. So post-disaster work needs to be done in phases. You give them first the basic need training, a middle level training in coping skills, CBT skills, and then you train up in the EDP for trauma. So 56 children participate in this pilot, and ages 5 to 18. I'm very proud to say this is the first 100% Puerto Rican sample in any trauma paper with kids in the world. And 98% of these kids receive services in Spanish. So one family opted for services in English. Also, I've never seen a paper in the literature like this. This was a pretty traumatized sample. The average number of traumas was 4, and 9 out of 10 kids endorsed polyvictimization. And what was interesting is Hurricane Maria wasn't the index trauma listed for these kids. Most kids reported that it was a traumatic loss or the grief of a loss of a loved one, sexual abuse, or exposure to domestic violence. And that's very common in the post-disaster world. Often we think we're treating the disaster, but really it's the underlying pre-existing adverse childhood effects and traumas that exacerbate and resurface when the disaster hits, or you're treating co-occurrent. This is a cohort that had gone through Zika, Irma, Maria, 2 earthquakes, COVID. Keep that in mind. And with all this, 64% completed treatment, all components. For those of you who don't know, TFCBT is a very intensive treatment, about 15 to 18 sessions. You see the kids, you see the caregivers, very intensive, but it's comparable to well-funded RCTs in the US. Fun fact, we have a similar pilot in El Salvador that had an 86% completion rate. My hypothesis for that was not one disaster throughout the study. They had exposure to violence, community violence, gang violence, but there was stability in basic resources and needs for these kids in El Salvador. Also, session completion took about the average that we see in well-controlled RCTs in the US without this level of exposure to disasters, and caregivers were committed. All the caregivers participated actively in treatment, which is consistent with the collectivistic values of Puerto Rico. And check this out, kids got better and in massive ways. So we use the Child Post-Traumatic Stress Scale for DSM-5. We also had to work with the developers to translate to Spanish, to validate it in Spanish so that we can use it. All these things take time, but we saw large reductions in youth report and caregiver report at the end of treatment. Although we weren't directly targeting depression and anxiety, we measured it because this is an unintended effect of TF. It reduces these two comorbid conditions, and we saw reductions, and we used the revised child anxiety and depression scale, and those are T-scores, large effects for caregiver and youth report after treatment. So we implemented TFCBT. It was feasible, acceptable, effective. So to end, and again, I want to apologize. This is rushed and patchy because it is. I would need a whole day to talk to you about the nuts and bolts, but this is what I want you to take home. When doing post-disaster work, when doing work with diverse communities, affected communities by a historical legacy of oppression, racism, lack of access to services, we need to listen first. We need to create space for that partner, that stakeholder to process, for us to earn their trust. And trust is earned by actions, consistent actions over time. Trust is earned by dropping what you're doing and saying, you matter, I've got you. Oh, this is when you can meet. Okay, I'll move things around. It's also built when we pay attention to basic need safety first. Also, it's important that you know what you can bring to the table, your team, and it cannot be a research study idea. Truly partnered work is about meeting a need, not extracting data. If that's what you're aiming to do, then you need to figure out what can I give? Who can I partner that can bring a tangible product, resource, training, something that will change the lives of these folks as we do the study, if you will. Sometimes you need to let it go. We abandoned so many side projects that we started because they stopped being in the best interest of our partners. And we had to partner with local experts. In this process, I've become a great collaborator with the University of Puerto Rico Psychiatry Department. They're on all of our grants and all of our projects. They have so much expertise on the island with mental health. And that's not something I need to fill. If I could go back, I would have built this relationships before the next disaster happened. So unfortunately, climate change is going to affect us all. It already is. So the moment to build partnerships is now. We published a paper on this. If you want to check it out, it's down there. I'm going to end with one note on cultural humility. Even though I share the identity of the peoples that I've been helping, I stopped living there in 2009. So it has been a very humbling experience for me to realize that my background and identity that I hold does not equal full understanding of the lived experience of the Puerto Rican that lives on the island. And stepping back and acknowledging that and having humility with that and not assuming and not putting myself in, I represent this category is really important when we share the identity of the people we're working with. And that's just my personal experience. And finally, this is food for thought in my recent work in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of talk about the term resilience, right? And how it's important to build resilience. Kids need to be resilient. Kids are resilient. But lately in Puerto Rico, there's been an outcry for stop asking us to be resilient and instead fix the systems that are making us vulnerable. And I think we need to start questioning this in the trauma field, in the disaster field, in the climate field. Like, what are we doing to partner with systems level change, with big picture changes that focus on the conditions that are driving these outcomes that we're seeing in terms of trauma exposure, PTSD, mental health concerns? A little bit controversial, but I wanted to bring it up. All right, I'm going to stop right there and let our moderators ask any questions of the audience. Thanks for your time, and so sorry for the interruptions. Just going to leave this up there. More information on a recent podcast I did with the U.S. Surgeon General. That's a separate story I don't have time to tell, but they found me on Twitter and they interviewed me. So if you want the full version of what happened in Puerto Rico, it's right there.
You're getting all sorts of applause. So thank you very
Awesome
much.
sauce.
Thank you for your grace and your patience and your ability to pivot, which demonstrates just how adaptable you are. I'm sure some of that came from in the field, learning how to adapt.
Yes, preach.
Courtney, do you want to? I have questions, but I think we probably only have time for one. So.
Yes, I think you're probably right. I know Greg had a question that was raised earlier. Maybe that would be a good place to start.
That sounds good.
Greg, do you want to share your question?
If not, I can sort of paraphrase. Greg's been working with. Oh no, there you are. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just had to get to the button. So thank you very much for your time in the study. I'm on the faculty at Wharton, and the question has to do with and you made reference to it. I'm about, I don't know, something approaching 70 hours into a 6-year plus study of first responders in the FDNY to September 11th. Right. So that's both an individual and an organizational study, which no doubt you're well aware is far more than the day. The bodies continue to pile up inside the FDNY from medical consequences of that. So I just wondered, in your work, and it's it's admirable work, both in terms of your stance toward the work, as a researcher and being explicit about that, I think, as well as the work inside and just the importance of doing this work. How do you differentiate, and do you, in terms of when you think of different kinds of trauma or different kinds of community? So, there's some really good federal studies, as you're no doubt aware, of community, across community trauma with earthquakes, floods, tornadoes. And September 11th, not just the city, which was big, but the work I've been doing FDNY. So any comment about what's similar or different as you look at different kinds of what we might call community trauma? Community could be organizational, things that you think are similar or different as you look at that. And then in terms of trying to implement treatment both during the day or in FDNY, particularly over the ensuing 6 to 9 months, and then over the 20 years plus at this point. So any comments you got about similarities or differences regarding community trauma
Yeah.
and treating would be great to hear. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Due to time, I'll just give my 15-second answer. Similarities, phases. In every disaster work, community violence, terrorism, disaster, hurricanes, you start with basic needs first, and then you work your way up once those are met. So Maslow's hierarchy is key. Differences, terrorist attacks and the aftermath, there's complicated additional fears. There's usually tied to a targeted act of violence, right? That has ramifications for the community versus a hurricane. Everyone can agree it did not purposely target you. It's a natural event, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, and the sad part is there's not a lot of literature documenting this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
I'm
Dr.
so sorry that I
Orengo-Aguayo.
ran over. I want to be
No,
respectful of
that was
everyone's
not your
time.
fault at all. So we will draw this to a close, but thank you everyone for being here. Have a wonderful afternoon. Rosaura, that was brilliant work. And
Thank you.
I may reach out offline because I would love to talk to you more. There's so much more.
My pleasure. Take care.
Thank you.